Welcome back. And we're moving into our first conversation this morning with representatives of the Bureau of Standards. They are preparing for the celebration of World Standards Day on October 14th. They're going to be telling us about some of the events that they have lined up to have us understand more the importance of standards. We have with us Lloyd Oriano, who is a standards officer, and we have Rodolfo Gutierrez, who's a consumer protection liaison officer. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Okay, so let's start off with the very standard question, literally. In being able to break down what it is to have standards, whether within the business community or in a wider society.
First, I would like to discuss what is the significance of World Standards Day. We all know that it is not a widely celebrated day in Belize, but we are trying to see how best we can change that, because at the end of the day, when you talk about standards, it's something that affects our daily lives, right? So basically, the day was set forth in terms of celebrating all those who contribute to the process of standards development. All right, so at the end of the day, what we want, even in Belize, I mean, it's a day to celebrate. People have this misconception about standards implementation, about standards development, about who ultimately develops standards. I know that the Bureau of Standards, we are ultimately responsible for standards in Belize. But at the end of the day, the process involves all those technical experts that contribute into developing the technical requirements of any standards, right? So it's certain requirements that any food-related product or any commodity or any good needs to comply with. Who develops those would be the persons involved, the industry, the stakeholders. That's we want people to understand, that it's the stakeholders,
the driving force,
who drives that process, and it is very, very important for them. At the end of the day, it is for them, all right?
Yeah.
So around the world, this is how standards are being developed, in that technical experts provide their input into the process, and then that standard becomes the norm, all right? So that is what the day is supposed to do, to celebrate all those persons involved in the process. Even in Belize, I want to appreciate and give thanks to all those persons who contribute to the process of standards development in Belize. Because nowadays we are starting to see that the demand for the increase of standards is, it's currently growing.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think now there is a bit more of a normalized view as to the importance of standards. And, once upon a time we used to talk about what you would do for Belize and Belizean market and what you would do for the international market, and usually there was a very large gap. Now people expect the best in whatever product or service that they are receiving. And even with simple practices like going to a gas pump and seeing the certification from the Bureau of Standards, knowing that it has been checked to give you exactly what it says it's going to give you. So in a society where we're starting to understand why we should have our businesses and service providers compliant with standards, what is your role when you start to have people making those demands?
Well, basically, we have to assess what the situation is, all right? Basically, we call it a request, but we have to assess what the situation is in terms of looking at it from a practical standpoint, in terms of whether is it a standard that you really require at the end of the day, or if it is one, then we have to evaluate it in terms of providing a justification, looking at it more carefully, because at the end of the day, we cannot really invest all our resources in every situation. So it's a matter of priority, right? So will it have a significant impact on trade, right? Will it address societal concerns and things like that? We have to address at the end of the day when we look at any specific standard that we want to develop, right? Because at the end of the day, when we're putting in standards, it's in the best interest of the country, it's in the best interest of the stakeholder. It's by no means wanting to put a bottleneck in terms of trade, right? So at the end of the day, it's to facilitate trade. That's what we want to do.
The other issue to address too is to find out whether the standards already exist. I mean, you don't want to start from scratch. If there's a standard already in place, a regional standard that we could perhaps capitalize on, then we could adapt it or customize it to our need. That's a key thing.
Right, and I can imagine that gathering the information necessary in order to keep up with standards that are not just specific to Belize because we're not an island,
Right.
you know.
Correct.
How easy is it, or how, talk about that process of gathering the information that is relevant to food and packaging and things like that?
Yes, so a very key point that my colleague mentioned is that we need not to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
So we look at what exists out there. So we look at similar economies of scale, we look at similar subject matter in terms of what is it exactly that we're going to deal with, and then we use a referencing method in that we reference all those things. I mean, you can think about anything, and the chances of an existing international or regional standard is very high. So, you know, we just reference those standards. We get all those sourcing materials, and how we get them is because the Bureau of Standards, we are memberships to a lot of international organizations, such as the International Organization for Standardization. We are part of the Pan American Standards Commission. We are part of I'm sorry, I'm not explaining what these organizations mean, but if we go into
Very
that,
important
bodies
some
of
larger
what you
bodies,
do.
yes. Larger bodies that we have access to this
Yeah.
documentation, all right? So we get those. We try to see which one would be the most applicable to Belize. We gathered all the technical expertise via a technical committee.
Yeah.
And then that technical committee is responsible to review the documentation and to ensure that what we're putting on the table is something that can be met by Belize. Mindful that if there is an existing international or regional standard, we do not want to deviate much from that.
Yeah.
We want to try as much as possible to harmonize with that standard, all right? So if in case we do try to deviate, then we must have some type of legitimate reason as to why we are deviating.
Would that kind of deviation be related to things like cost?
No, it will be related to perhaps health and safety
Okay.
and things like that, all right? So, or the environment.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's moving away from the practice of, and not that this is a bad term, but Belizeanizing how we do
Yes.
things.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
If you are producing a jam, let's say, food is one of the easier ones to
Yeah.
use. You know, you want to make sure it's something that you can be able to sell in any other market, and because it meets the proper health standards, packaging standards,
Yeah.
and that Belizeans should have those very same standards ensured. Now, I want to talk about some of the gains that the Bureau of Standards has been able to make over the years. You know, we've talked about metrology, the measuring. We've talked about helping companies become certified in particular international standards. I know there's been a lot of work taking place. So let's start there with some of the achievements that you can acknowledge as we head into World Standards Day.
As the Bureau of Standards, one of the key things would be in the area of standardization. If, as an institution, the national institution responsible for standards in Belize, if we are trying to let the key stakeholders know, look, you should implement standards, you should comply with standards, then as an institution, we ourselves have to
Be certified.
implementing standards. So we decided that we are going to implement ISO 9001, which is simply a quality management system standard. All right. So
ISO is International
Organization for Standardization,
Thank you.
right? So yeah, we took on that project, and so we are now implementing ISO 9001, so that our process for standards development is an internationally recognized process. All right.
So you use standards to determine your standards.
Correct.
That's what you're saying.
Standards to develop standards. All right. So that is
Being a certified organization under the ISO 9001, what it portrays, what it shows everyone is that we are certified to operate within a professional environment. We have our procedures in place that dictate that the output of our services will certainly be beneficial to the customer at the ending of the day, and we have all the requirements that this standard is instilling on you, and that what makes the quality management system a viable thing, right?
Yeah.
And we have the distinction of being the first public agency in Belize
Right.
certified to ISO 9001. So
That's right.
that's a very big gain.
And just to update you, we that version, the 9001 2008 ISO standard is almost nullified. It will be nullified here in 2018. So we have to do an upgrade of that version of that ISO within the next few months. No?
Yeah.
So that is another task that we have at hand for our internal purposes. No.
Yeah. And that happens because every day you recognize new threats and weaknesses in any system, and so it can continuously be improved upon, I'd imagine. Now, let's take a diversion for a bit, because I wanted to get your comments on it, and this is something that impacts people directly. And we're talking about labeling of prepackaged goods. We spoke a bit with the Pharmacy Association about how it'll impact drugs coming into the country, but it also applies to food. And in fact, the Bureau of Standards will be kind of the gatekeepers for this process. Talk to us about that.
Okay, so let's talk about specifically now about the labeling of prepackaged food standards. So we decided to review the current regulation standards on prepackaged foods is outdated from 1998. So, and then we had recent revisions to the CARICOM standard for labeling packaged foods. We also have ongoing works with the international standards, the Codex Alimentarius. It's simply the international body that deals with food and food-related products. So whatever you do in terms of labeling of prepackaged foods, you want to align yourself with the regional and those international standards, because then for purposes of conducting trade, this is what you have to comply with, right? So it's basically the decision of harmonizing with those standards. All right. So as an example, the current standard that we have does not require the declaration of a nutritional content, whilst the international and the regional standard does require, right? So a nutritional content,
that's very important.
It's very key.
And a lot of people look for that.
Yes,
too,
because consumers are now more critical in terms of their purchasing, right? So they need to be informed. Some persons have some certain health conditions that you need to look out for these things, right? So as an example, that was not a requirement, so that's why we're harmonizing. But still, the standard, as how it's going to be revised for the national level, it does not really require a nutritional content declaration. However,
so if I make it here in Belize, I'm not required to put a nutritional label.
So far that is one contention so far, that we're trying to gather as much feedback from stakeholders, whether this is okay or not. But mindful that if you are going to export, this is a requirement. This is a must. There is no question about it. So one of the things is that key stakeholders we want them to know is that once you're complying with the labeling requirements, there's a high chance that you're already complying with an export market requirements in terms of labeling of packaged foods. Earlier you mentioned about pharmaceuticals. Now, one thing, unfortunately, the Standards Act does not cover drugs nor pesticides. So those are governed by their own relevant legislation. However, if there is a need to develop any, for example, labeling of standard for labeling of pharmaceuticals, that can be done via their regulation. That is currently an initiative undertaken in CARICOM right now, where they are looking at developing of labeling specifically for pharmaceuticals, and that is what that piece of those requirements, that standard would cover that one. But the labeling packaged food standard will not cover pharmaceuticals.
Now, when do we expect the rollout of these proper labeling to imported prepackaged goods? Because one of the things I also thought was very important is nutritional labels are very important. You're right. You need to know the cholesterol, sugar content because of the conditions we're battling in Belize. But also, it has to be in English or at least Spanish. And we find Indonesian, we find all types of characters on foods that we don't know what it is.
So currently the standards are at the public inquiry stage. Right. So I think that this Friday there was the deadline date for any stakeholder to submit comments. We do not only notify in Belize, but we notify the entire world in terms of whoever countries are members of the World Trade Organization. They have access to look at the document and be able to comment, because at the end of the day, it does impact trade. All right. So we have to be mindful of that. And so we've received comments already, not only from Belize, but from other countries such as the USA. They have submitted a few comments on the draft documents. So after this, then we would produce what we call a final draft standard, right? That will then be ready for approval. And so we are looking at having this document ready for implementation by perhaps April of next year.
What is the most interesting feedback you've gotten since?
Well, so far it has been positive. To be honest with you, setting the standard is the easiest thing to do. To be honest with you, right? when you talk about conformity assessment now, that is where you
The
need
challenges will be.
that is where you will meet all the challenges. And so far, the feedback that I have gotten has mostly to do with conformity assessment rather than the actual requirements in the
To be
standard.
clear, confirming that it has the label or confirming that it has what it says in the
It's
label.
enforcement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Enforcement is-
Those two things,
Okay.
confirming that it has the required information and also confirmation that the information on the label is
accurate.
indeed accurate.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
So that is a really, that is where the challenge will come in for us.
Yeah.
You know, I know that not every business in Belize wants to be export ready, but can you
Yes.
talk to us a little bit about why there's not a correlation between export standards and national standards? Because I can imagine that if you're a small business and maybe you might end up being a Marie Sharp one day and you want to get into exportation, and that's a whole separate process. Why not just start from now and have it in existence from now, so that when you do want to export, you're just
Yes,
one
you see,
step
the
ahead.
thing is that it has to do with the culture for standards and quality in Belize.
Okay.
So persons at the end of the day, you could say, okay, you can readily associate with quality. Okay, quality something, all right? So,
yeah.
but then you cannot really associate with what does that mean? Quality means, it means standards. You cannot achieve quality without applying certain requirements, right? So it's very important that, or usually people say good thing, or the average consumer does not resonate quite clearly or associating anything with respect to standards or how that came about. I mean, and then a lot of times we try to focus on only those products for exports, but I mean, you have, as consumers,
Yeah.
we should also be mindful of that, be demanding
Definitely.
of
Yeah.
certain requirements, because at the end of the day, especially if you have a consumable product,
Yeah.
right? So
It's
I'm
true.
trying to say that the issue of health and safety cannot be compromised.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the end of the
And
day.
we also drive the demand as well
Right.
as consumers.
The other thing is
Yeah.
that I believe that a lot of people view standards as an expense,
Right.
and not as an investment.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and you should look at it as serving you or providing a long-term effect, and being able to provide that
and
profit that you want at
and-
the end of the day.
And the persons who are already exporting can attest to that.
Yeah.
They can attest to that. But for the average persons who are not exporting, who are only supplying for the domestic market, they seem to be, it's a business as usual type of thing, right?
So that's a part of what you're undertaking this week, which is a workshop geared towards helping small and micro businesses, but through the organizations that help them. Tell us a bit about the
yes,
workshop.
it ties into, we spoke of World Standards Day from the initial discussion, so it ties into that. So you have every year, World Standards Day is celebrated under a specific theme. So the theme for this year is Standards Make Cities Smarter. Now for Belize, that is a really complicated or a broad thing to mention.
Elevated type of statement,
Yes.
right?
So, but what can make cities smarter? What did these countries, for example, such as Singapore did, what London is doing, and those countries are doing in terms of having a smart cities? It really focuses on partnerships,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and specifically smart partnerships. So our sub-theme for this year is Standards Make Partnerships Smarter. Yes.
We adjusted it to
to ours.
We put our own Belizean
so that,
stamp on it.
so that one day we can reach the smart city
Yeah,
level, right?
yeah.
So we have, today we are we're going to be working with different business support organizations.
Okay. So those are like what, your Beltrade, your...
Beltrade, even DFC, the
DFC.
financial institutions, because if you're lending
Cooperative
money,
department and
yes,
stuff like that.
you have
Yeah.
all those. So all of those, we're going to be having a few presentations from them, and at the end of the day, see how best we can create that partnership,
Yeah.
all for the purposes of increasing or strengthening the culture for standards and quality in Belize, because we have to be on the same page.
Yeah.
I mean, as the Bureau of Standards, we're on a roll. You know, we want to. We have already taken care of or looking at in terms of the industrial metrology aspect of
Yeah.
of our institution, but
Yeah.
also looking at the standardization aspect. We all have to be on the same page.
Can I ask, what is the relationship between the licensing bodies and the Bureau of Standards?
All right, so licensing bodies, for example, you have the Belize Tourism Board who licenses registers tour operators. So they are now realizing that that standards are very key in terms of
How they market them,
improving the quality. So they realize that the licensing nowadays is just an administrative requirement.
Yeah.
But we're trying to change it in terms of if you're engaged in certain activities, that you're complying with at least certain minimum requirements.
Yeah.
So that is now being tied into the licensing requirements. So it then becomes a technical requirement via technical regulation. All right.
Yeah.
So more and more they are realizing now. So if you want to go and get a tour guide or a tour operator license now, you have to demonstrate that you're complying with certain requirements. That's why we are working a lot with the Belize Tourism Board to develop standards in all the what we call high-risk tourist activities, such as zip lining, such as canopy tours or rappelling, those types of things.
And with other entities like Ministry of Health, for example?
Yes. The Ministry of Health is one of the key stakeholders for us in terms of the ensuring health and safety. So to every standard, you would find that, especially if it's a food-related commodity standard, will always be an aspect of health-related requirements.
Yeah.
Right? So there's where they come in. They would then revise those and then look carefully the requirements that we're putting in place, such as the rice standard the last time. You recall the rice issue we had? So now you find your rice neatly packaged, properly packaged. You can now choose from which processor you want to buy your rice from. You can now choose which grade you want to buy.
Yeah.
And as it relates to the equipment and the processing of the foods that we sell in Belize, how do you, and I don't want to say the word police because you're not a policing organization, but how do you ensure that that's also in line with the standards of the Bureau?
Yeah, you see what Standards does, Standards basically makes our lives easier, all right? So as an example, one of the activities that we do is net content verification, right? So, for example, the rice. At the processor level, the rice was being repackaged at the retail level. So you find that you would have to verify all at the retail level. So now, because it's prepackaged at the processing end, we can just need to verify at the processing end now.
Yeah. So you check the machine to make sure it delivers 1 pound
So
each
it makes
time.
life easier for us in terms of
Instead of
the
checking each
enforcement
individual
and
bag that
market
it's
level.
1 pound.
Yes.
Okay.
So that is what Standards can do for you at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So yes, that is exactly what we have today in terms of the workshop.
Now, I imagine organizations like Beltrade are already up to date because they're kind of helping people with startups in encouraging them to adhere to minimum standards or regional standards.
Yes.
But what about financiers? Because that's also key, and you said they're included, but if I imagine I go in to start up whatever business that I'm interested in, I don't necessarily have my license as yet. I don't have I need to get the money first. And maybe I only budget, my business plan only includes starting up, but not necessarily starting up at the standard that I need to. What has been the conversation prior to this workshop, and how do you get them to understand that they have to ensure that who comes in for the money also is already thinking in terms of meeting standards?
Well, that concrete discussion with them, we hope to have today.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because honestly speaking, there's a little bit of disconnect with them in terms of ensuring that, well, of course, the financiers, if you're providing finance to a particular SME, at the end of the day, I think you would feel better knowing that they are complying with standards than not.
We have minimally had conversations with them in terms of sharing the information on quality infrastructure. I see the need to incorporate standards within their loan portfolios and what have you. One body, I think specifically, that is engaged in who has already made a positive move in terms of incorporating standards is DFC. As far as I can recall, in our meeting that we had with the energy efficiency, what they're doing, they're lending money for solar water heaters at a very attractive interest rate, which shows you the interest that the organization has in terms of making this country an environmental, friendly country.
And you have to do an energy audit as well to qualify.
So not only that, but the capacity building for their staff, the loans officer needs to be aware of these standards and how to go about monitoring their loan portfolios as a result of these type of loans they're engaged in. So that's one DFC can be applauded for that. No?
Yeah.
And I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I was about to ask how has the buy-in been so far from different businesses
Okay.
as it relates to the evolvement of the standard?
Well, according to them, in terms of that solar water heater, it's been something that people are now considering. I mean, in terms of cutting costs, energy bills and stuff, it will certainly give you a very good saving as you go along. You know? So,
Yeah.
so it's something that will probably be more attractive as they go along. People will be more interested in it.
Yeah. So let's talk about the other activities you have lined up for this week. The workshop today is geared towards business support organizations. What's happening for the rest of the week?
Okay, so on Thursday we also have a forum at the University of Belize. So we're partnering with the University of Belize to actually, but that is what we're going to have on Thursday, is that we're going to have several institutions coming together, presenting to university students, because at the end of the day, university students, you know, in terms of urbanization, you find that people usually concentrate in cities, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, you have to know what are the plans of these institutions, like BTL, like, which other ones have?
Yeah, like Central Building Authority.
Central Building
you have
Authority,
the city
because
councils and
nowadays, you're not only talking about a building, you know,
Belize
nowadays you're talking about
all of these people will be participating.
nowadays you're talking about an energy efficient building,
Yeah.
right? So you have to know what are the plans in place
Yeah.
from the Central Building Authority, what plans they have in terms of going forward, what
Yeah.
projects they have in place, so people need to know.
And it's about a culture shift. So you want to start from
Right.
students who are
Right.
then going to be
Yes,
employees.
yes,
And
yes.
All right. And so the workshop today is a closed session for those who are invited.
Right.
Yes.
And on Thursday, is
It's
it
an
open
open-
to
It's
the
an
public?
open, yes,
All
Open
right.
session.
Where is it and what time?
On Thursday, it's at the University of Belize Belmopan campus.
Okay.
It starts at around 9 until about 1 o'clock.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and anyone can attend
Yes.
and
Yes,
be able to understand
certainly.
more about smart partnerships.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. What else would you like the Belizean public to understand as we close about why we as consumers and people who live in this country, why we should care about the standards that are implemented?
Well, one of the first things I want to mention, that as part of the standards development process, consumers play a very key role
Yeah.
in the development of any standard. So that is one thing that we are still lacking in Belize yet in terms of the standards process. So when we develop standards, we find that we usually have the technical experts there, but the consumers are
Right.
not there. And that, of course, is due to the lack of perhaps consumer groups and active consumer groups in Belize. But any consumer can be part of the process,
Right.
so that you know what the requirements are.
Yeah.
It's better knowing than not knowing.
Yeah.
Right? And so, I mean, the Bureau of Standards, we're always here in terms of assisting, in terms of being receptive to any requirements or any issues that are happening in the market in terms of the provision of food-related services.
Yeah.
I mean, you always have those types of issues. So we also have the Consumer Protection Hotline that
Yeah.
we can call into and
Right.
express
Yeah.
the whatever
Any complaints that
concerns
you may
are.
have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell us about that, Rodolfo.
Well, we do have a consumer hotline, 0800 call us, where consumers can pick up the phone and call free of cost,
Yeah.
of course, to establish any complaint and concern that they may have in the market, within the marketplace. No? We, as you may know, we don't have a legislation in place for consumer protection, unfortunately, but we try to use bits and pieces of different legislations that falls within our mandate to be able to try to mediate the situation and attempt to get some sort of redress for the consumers.
Yeah.
I can safely say that we do have a good record in terms of trying engaging and getting involved in different cases and being able to be successful in this attempt. No.
Yeah.
But that is there, but that's something that we need to encourage people to use.
I was
We
gonna
have
say.
it there, but we always are promoting it and everything. But people We'll call it, they call it straight line instead of they call it toll-free
Or
line.
I was going to tell you, they posted on Facebook instead of filing an official complaint.
Right.
Right.
They said that, yeah,
Which
because we
is-
have a procedure in place
Yeah.
to try to get some sort of redress.
Yeah.
So if you had substandard food, service, something that you know is wrong, and
Yeah.
you may even be able to say, miss, what you think is wrong is not
Yeah.
necessarily.
And even if it doesn't
Yeah.
fall within our auspices,
Yeah.
what we try to engage the relevant agency that is responsible, and we will definitely provide a response to the consumer. On a
So
timely basis.
0800
Call
call
us.
us.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for being here today, and we wish you the best of luck with your activities that you have scheduled for
Thank
this
you.
week as you celebrate World Standards Day.
Thank you for having us here.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
too. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll be speaking to representatives of the Mental Health Association about mental health in the workplace. So stay tuned.